Okay, welcome back. When we last left off, hold on a second. And when we last left off, we were on this slide here, and I was just finishing up, just kind of giving you some advice not to assume too much in terms of aesthetic similarities and what they mean about similarities of culture, and not to assume primitiveness in general. And while we're at it, we should remember that not all types of gesture, like I covered before, is the same. Some are more controlled than others, as we can see from these, and that even, like, let's say the comparison between these two, they're both controlled and they're both loose in certain parts, but their pairing of looseness and controlled is quite different. So before we go much further in talking about expression and mark making, we need to kind of fundamentally decide what we mean when we say a mark, and what do we mean when we say a line. How are marks different from lines? I think the fundamental difference is that lines, by their nature, have to be linear. They have to have a sense of a starting point and an end point, whereas marks can be linear, but they can be so short that they almost really don't have much of a sense of a beginning and an end. They can be simply just a mark that is directly applied. So, like, the simplest form would be kind of like a dot type mark. Um, so let's talk about that a little bit more. What are the differences between lines and marks? Now, if I was giving this lecture in class, I'd have everyone brainstorm a little bit before I showed the next slide with the list. But since we are doing this via video, you can brainstorm on it in your own time. But I'm not going to spend 2 minutes just us quietly looking at a blank screen. So this list here of comparing lines and marks, I think one of the main things I want you to kind of see from it is that there's a lot of connection, a lot of similarity, right? Lines can be very regular or very irregular, and so can marks. Lines can be very quick and slow. They can be very energetic or calm, and so can marks. But there are some things that are different, right? Lines are always linear, but they can either be long or short, like little staccato type lines, almost a mark. Whereas marks can be linear, but they don't have to be. They can be just like a big shape, um, whereas lines have to be linear, so therefore they can be straight or not straight. Um, and I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I want you, on your own time, you can look over this list some more and just think about all the different similarities and contrasts between these two lists. So, a mark, I think, we use the term in art, the term of art elements. We talk about the art elements, and those elements are line, shape, value, color, form, space, and others, usually texture, maybe pattern, depending on who's making the list. Mark never shows up on the list, and I kind of feel like that's a mistake. In some ways, I feel like the two most fundamental um, units of art, fundamental elements of art, are mark and surface. Like mark and then the thing that you put the mark on are really the two most fundamental elements of art. But I think, but a lot of people start with line. But I think that a mark in some ways is more fundamental than a line. But but I think it's important to think of like what makes a line an interesting thing, and why are lines important. Lines can create shapes, right? You can draw a set of lines and you can draw a triangle, and therefore you've not only created a line that goes around the triangle, but you've created the implied shape of the triangle in there. Lines can create value, and we're going to talk more about that specifically when we talk about your art assignment. Now, In art, people are constantly obsessing about the different kinds of lines, what types of lines people can make. And it's also important in engineering. I love this chart right here. And I tend to kind of collect these different, whether it's people from their sketchbooks brainstorming different types of lines or these charts of different kinds of lines that people can make. But I think actually um, actually caring about that does not help you understand art in any way. I think this cataloging does it. I mean, it's good to know that you could do it, but it's not necessarily going to help you understand art any better. The big distinctions, such as the distinction between regular lines and irregular lines, gestural versus controlled lines, um, those are important. But I think all the different possible types of lines is maybe less significant. So let's look at some very precise and controlled lines. Right, here are two examples. Here's a silhouette wall drawing and the Hans Holbein. They're both very, very controlled, but in very different ways. Right, obviously the silhouette is all straight lines, but almost none of them are perfectly, I don't think, well, actually, wait, that's not true. Very few of them are perfectly straight vertical, or I don't think a single one on here is a straight horizontal. Um, but they are all straight lines and they're all of equal width. Every single line is the same width to each other. There is not that in the Holbein. The lines are, um, they vary in width, they vary in pressure, and the lines are, um, all different kinds of lines, lots of curves, but they are also very, very controlled and precise. Similarly, loose gestural lines are not all the same as well. Here we have two great examples. This is a detail from a Frank Arabeck self-portrait, and then a Philip Guston drawing, and they're both extremely loose and gestural, but very, very different in qualities from each other. And then another category I want you to think about is fluid and calligraphic marks. We tend to think of, when marks are calligraphic, we think that they are curvilinear, they're fluid, and they tend to vary a lot in the line weight, the change of thick and thin on the lines. And here are two really great examples of very calligraphic marks. And they're very quite different from each other. And I think the most interesting thing is how they're using calligraphic mark for very different purposes. On the Bryce Marden, they're creating a lot of space, the marks are, because the under layers of marks, since they've been kind of washed over with repeated layers, they sit further back because they're pale, they don't have much contrast. But they also overall create this sense of a field, of a total surface. Whereas on the Lebrun, that change of line weight and that calligraphic flow is really in the service of creating volume in the form and creating a sense of gesture and energy to the figure. On the previous page, I said that these were quite a different way of making mark from looking someone like de Kooning, and I thought, well, we should look, if I'm going to mention de Kooning, we should also take another chance to look at de Kooning. We've already seen some de Kooning paintings. We've seen these two before, but I wanted you to see them on full size and just kind of think about how this type of hand is quite different from these types of hands, and then how that's quite different from Susan Rothenberg, who we've seen before as well. And I think that Rothenberg is probably the artist who most often people talk about her hand, her specific way of making a mark, as almost functioning like a language. It varies just enough, and we're getting close to the end, but I think I can do it. So we just have a few more slides to get to, and I just wanted to, in these last few, to reiterate this idea that looseness and gesturalness can be something that that seems to come out of a very authentic place and is very spontaneous and energetic, like this Franz Klein, but that there are many artists who have done the opposite, where they've tried to create um, a loose, expressionistic type of mark in the most unexpressed way. This is not created by a big, giant brushstroke. This is created very carefully and every bit of color is put in, as a grid of dots, dot by dot. And probably the best example of that comparison would be these two artists. Glenn Brown is a fantastic contemporary artist. In the beginning of his career, he was primarily focused on paintings